Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. A really warm welcome to the IOE. Now, I'm really pleased to be introducing this, which is the latest in our Professorial Public Lecture series, which of course provides an opportunity to share and celebrate our senior colleagues' research. First of all, the usual housekeeping matters. You'll hopefully have seen the Wi-Fi login instructions as you arrived in the building. The Twitter hashtag is #IOE Lectures, or one word. That's #IOE Lectures. And we're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, please take the doors at the back of the hall, which will lead you up the stairs and out onto Bedford Way. And if anybody's unable to use the stairs, if the alarm sounds, please move to the doors on your left, and our fire marshals will escort you from an alternative route. But to the lecture. So our speaker this evening is Doug Bourn, who's Professor of Development Education here at the IOE. Development education, or global learning, or global citizenship education, as it's sometimes known, is concerned with recognizing the links between people's lives throughout the world and the cause of global social justice. It's about critical thinking and challenging stereotypes. And it's about action to build a more just and sustainable world. It's about giving people the skills and the confidence to enact such change. Doug's career has placed him at the centre of development education in this country and abroad, and in terms of both its conceptualisation and its advancement. From 1993 to 2006, Doug was director of the Development Education Association, which was then a national umbrella body working with over 240 member and partner organisations in the UK and overseas. From there, he moved to the IOE, where he established the Development Education Research Centre. For over a decade now, that centre has served as the hub for policymakers and practitioners across Europe on development education and related themes, across all phases of education, in both formal and informal settings. Alongside, Doug's been a member of numerous government advisory panels and working groups in this field, and from 2008 to 2016, he was founder editor of the International Journal of Development Education and Global Learning. His publications include The Theory and Practice of Development Education, which was published in 2015, and which has become a central point of reference in development education. And just this year, he published Understanding Global Skills for 21st Century Professions. And I'm also pleased to say that Doug is active within UCL and the IOE in bringing a global dimension to our teaching, as well as to initiatives like UCL's Grand Challenges, which cultivate cross-disciplinary collaborations to address societal challenges. So without further ado, Doug, can I please invite you to present your lecture?
Wow, thanks Becky, and thanks everyone for coming this evening. When we were planning this, we thought Monday before Christmas wasn't really quite sure it was going to be the best time, but thanks everyone for coming. And also, as I'm sure you're aware that this lecture is being live streamed around the world, and I must apologise to those of you who are watching this via live stream around the world, because I know some of you have got up very early in the morning in various places in South Asia and Australasia. So very many thanks to everyone for listening to what I have to say. The other thing I wanted to say before I formally begin is that I'm doing something that I've very rarely done before, and that's to read something to you and to read what I'm going to say. I'm doing that for two reasons. One, because I'm very nervous, but secondly, because there are very things in what I want to cover that are quite personal to me, and which is something I'm not used to doing. We're all used to sort of giving lectures about things we believe and support. But the first part of my lecture is going to be about me and about my personal journey to be here this evening. And in that process, there'll be a number of things that I want to refer to that may be a little bit surprising, but hopefully you'll see the reasons why I'm referring to them. My presentation has its theme, Education for Social Change, the role and importance of education to be at the heart of changing the world. We live in a world of constant change, of 30-second sound bites, instant messaging and fake news. It's also a world of increasing intolerance, of bipolar opposites, and retrenchment into forms of economic nationalism. The outward manifestations of this we know as Trump, Brexit, stigmatizing the other, what we don't understand. Education, whilst not been the answer to all the ills of the world, can play an important role in broadening horizons, looking to the world through different perspectives, developing the skills to listen, engage in dialogue, and rethink one's own views. But what sort of education and in what form? What I plan to do in this presentation is to show through my own personal journey what I see as the key elements of education for social change. I will make reference to people who have inspired me. Among the people I refer to are John Dewey, R.H. Tawney, Antonio Gramsci, Paulo Freire, and Henry Giroux. I'll, at the end of my presentation, give a plug about my new book. I'm happy to sign copies outside if anyone wants to buy a copy at a special price just for this evening. Someone a few months ago asked me, how would you summarize your educational philosophy? I said it was my career, which has always been about the power and potential of education to secure social change. Education has always been very important to me. I'm the son of a train driver who failed his 11 plus and was told by my teacher at the age of 17, you can apply to university, but you have little chance of getting in. Not only did I go to university, I had a very special 8 years at Keele University, and I'm very pleased to see some of my friends from Keele are here this evening, with a first degree in history and politics, a certificate in education, and a PhD under the supervision of the late and great John Eggleston, who had continued some work here with the founding of Trenton Books, which, as we know, is now part of IOE Press. My doctorate was on the development of Labour Party ideas in education, was really a historical thesis. So it's therefore not surprising that the first part of my lecture this evening is more provide some historical context to some of the things I see as important about education for social change. But I want to first start with making reference to the American educationalist John Dewey, who I think was quite influential in lots of early educational thinkers in this country, who in the early decades of the 20th century provided a vision and purpose for education that connected the needs of society and framed an approach to learning that had a distinctive pedagogical approach. The ideas of democracy and social reform are continually discussed in Dewey's writings on education. For him, education and democracy were intertwined, a way of life. Dewey made a strong case for the importance of education not only as a place to gain knowledge, but also as a place to learn how to live. In his eyes, the purpose of education should not revolve around the acquisition of a predetermined set of skills, but rather the realization of one's full potential. In addition to helping students realize their full potential, Dewey acknowledged that education and schooling are instrumental in creating social change. One of the people in the UK who was clearly influenced by his writings was R.H. Tawney, who was the architect and leading figure behind the development of Labour Party thinking on education between the wars. Tawney's thinking, however, needs to be put in a broader context of development of various streams of Labour Party ideas on education. Among them was this perception of knowledge as power, promoted by the Workers' Education Association. There was also other assumptions about education being for socialism, and this is particularly seen for the writings of Keir Hardie and some of the early work of Rams and MacDonald, who they saw socialism as indistinguishable from the moral and physical improvement of people. Public opinion, rather than class struggle, they were suggesting, was seen as a vehicle for social change. More radical positions were taken from a more Marxist perspective, who saw the emphasis to be on education to enable the creation of class-conscious workers. And a part of my thesis looked at particularly the work of the Labour Colleges movement, who talked about giving people the education to have a vision to make a better world. But one of the most perceptive writers I found to my work for my PhD was that of Beryl Pring, who in a pamphlet, Education, Capitalist and Socialist, saying while she was critical of mainstream Labour thinking in seeing a social transformation through a general permeation of knowledge and culture, she was critical of this. She saw it much more as a class phenomenon. But what was important was she recognised the need to work through existing institutions to secure social change. What I think this raised were issues that then became more prevalent in the 1930s, was the creation of a movement around education for citizenship and democracy. It was during this period you saw the emergence of networks like the Association for Citizenship and the Council for Education for World Citizenship. And I think in this context, one can see an evolving and changing climate about seeing the relationship of education and social change. I see R.H. Tawney is important because he combined a pragmatic approach to securing educational reforms, providing evidence to justify what changes to the class-based nature of the schooling system need to be made, with engagement in the debates around pedagogy. He also recognised the importance of social thinking about the purpose of education. He was one of the few to pose questions about pedagogy by saying that what was taught was less important than the angle from which it was approached and the spirit in which it was handled by the teacher. His conception of socialism was based on general principles, on changes in social cooperative relationships, with an emphasis on the ideal of fellowship. He suggested that imaginatively handled, education could break down the possessive individualism of a capitalist culture. His approach to education implied, however, that education was neutral. I personally had, at this time in my life, when I was at university, was in a dilemma between the thinking and my interest in Tawney and the sort of more critical of education about being its relationship to dominant ideological forms in society. And I was particularly at the one stage influenced by the work of the French Marxist Louis Althusser, who talked about education and ideological state apparatuses. But what I learned from my own educational experience that I should come on to is that education, whilst clearly been a site of ideological struggle, is not just a passive role where teachers and educationists are the passive recipients of dominant thinking. They are themselves active participants in securing an education system and teaching that they themselves want to have an influence on. In my view, what I've come to learn is that perhaps too many radical educationalists have critiqued the problems of education without addressing and recognizing that teachers themselves have found their ways of dealing with these challenges. Therefore, going back to Tawney, whilst today some of his ideas can appear to be rather naive, his thinking did influence educational policies and practices, and he had a vision of a close relationship between education and social change. What I also learned from him is this comes about from engagement in policies and practices and identifying where and how advances can be made. My thinking and research on these areas was developed, as I said, whilst at Keele University in the 1970s, which in many ways was a laboratory for lots of these new thinking about different approaches to education and learning. But also during this period, I became acquainted with what became called the radical educationalists from North and Latin America. And the first I want to refer to is this publication that I really enjoyed then, and when I come back to read it again in preparation of this lecture, I thought, great, still important today, which is Teaching as a Subversive Activity. This book by Postman and Weingarten, first published in 1969, starts with the famous Tom Paxton song, "What Did I Learn in School Today?" It's a prophetic volume about ways in which teaching has become geared towards examinations with an educational approach that assumes pupils are passive recipients of knowledge. And here he outlined, you can see what they saw as the ills of education. And they started to question this dominant educational thinking of the time of concepts of absolute truth, of the fixed state of things, of simple mechanical causality, that differences only exist in opposing forms, that somehow knowledge is given. Postman and Weingarten offered instead an alternative perspective on education by encouraging an approach that develops inquiring, flexible, creative, innovative, tolerant young people who can face uncertainty without disorientation, who can formulate viable and new meanings to meet changes to the environment which threaten our survival. Remember, that was written in 1969. 50 years later, how prophetic and valuable that still is today. I will come back to some of these themes when I start talking more about global learning. The second great influence on my work was the great Brazilian educationalist Paulo Freire, who I had the privilege to meet when I was at Kiel in the 1970s, and whose influence has remained with me throughout my career, and who in many ways remains my educational inspiration. He's also had a major influence on a range of academics and researchers here at IOE. What I found in Freire was so important to my research was enable me to move beyond the Althusser critique. He said that education can be an instrument to facilitate conformity and support for the current social system, but it also can be at the same time an opportunity for learners to critically reflect on the world in which they live, and most importantly, the role they can play in transforming it. To Freire, education could not therefore be divorced from pedagogy, how we teach and what we teach. He suggested that knowledge should be seen as being constructed through dialogue, and this only emerged through reflection, debate, invention, and reinvention. Within education, Freire and his disciples, such as Henry Giroux, have argued that whilst dominant societal ideologies can be seen within education, there's also the space and opportunity for counter-hegemonic approaches to exist and thrive. The challenge is how best to facilitate and support this, and I'll come back to this when I review the Global Learning Programme in England, that I see as an example of a counter-hegemonic programme, despite being funded by UK government. Henry Giroux commented, for Freire, pedagogy was central to a formative culture that makes both critical consciousness and social action possible. Pedagogy in this sense is connecting learning to social change. It was a project and provocation that challenged students to critically engage with the world so they could act on it. What I learned from Freire and others was that however it's easy to critique and to philosophize about the ills of education, what is needed are models and approaches that can challenge the dominant orthodoxies of education. And on this, I found it in a rather interesting and unusual youth organization called the Woodcraft Folk. As I was completing my doctoral studies, I was looking for an organization that could help me put my emerging ideas about education for social change into practice, the potential role that education could play in transforming society. And I found this in the Woodcraft Folk, a co-educational, progressive and cooperative-based youth organization that will celebrate its centenary in 2025. I worked for them between 1977 and 1990, the last 7 years of which as its National Secretary and leading full-time officer. I worked there with a number of wonderful educationalists, some of whom are here tonight, to help me transform this rather perceived marginal youth organisation into being one that engaged new generations of families and young people who were seeking for an approach to education that was about social change. I was very proud, this is remembered in the 1980s, I was very proud of one comment about the folk during my time as head of the organisation from a youth inspector who came to visit me, who was rather concerned about the direction I was taking the organisation. He said, there was perception the Woodcraft folks have become seen as a haven for families and communities from the worst excesses of Thatcherism. I said, yes, that's true. And I remember writing an article about the Woodcraft folk at this time called Ideologically Sound Can Be Fun. And I think it was this sense in which I was looking for a progressive perspective about that was challenging some of the ideas around at the time, but also provided some way of engaging with the real-world, everyday issues. And to me, the Woodcraft folk summarise some of these things, where it says it seeks to develop in our members a critical awareness of the world in which they grow up. We urge them to seek and accept their responsibilities as citizens and to participate in the democratic process in order to care but bring about the changes they feel are necessary to create a caring society. It's an organisation that I saw as providing a progressive alternative that emphasised cooperation, social and gender equality, protection of the environment, and commitment to human rights. And it's in two areas where I saw the Woodcraft folk particularly important. One is giving young people the knowledge, skills, and values to make a better society. And secondly, to look beyond the nation state to an internationalist and global outlook. And I'm very pleased I can show you a very short introduction to an amazing new film about the Woodcraft folk produced by a young adult as part of their studies, which is just about to have its world premiere, which is called In My Youth.
Its original statement was to take inner city kids out to the country and let them have a good time outside of the city.
The Woodcraft folk is a movement which unites children, young people and all who are young in spirit.
The flame is in your heart.
The fire shall never die.
And what is their creed? Span the world with friendship.
There's so much awful things that happen around the world that even if everyone does have humanity, they don't apply it equally to everyone else.
And I think that last comment by a young adult in the organisation, I think, is very prophetic today, is that we need to move beyond a lot of the rhetoric we talk about common humanity, start putting it much more into practice. And this leads me on to what I suppose has become my intellectual home for the past 25 years, and which Becky referred to, and that is development education, which brought me here in 2006. In 1990, I had left the Woodcraft folk for Friends of the Earth, and from there, in 1993, established a new educational charity, the Development Education Association, later become Think Global, which brought together a series of networks in promoting learning about global and international issues. I'd already engaged with aspects of development education through my work in Woodcraft folk and also briefly at Friends of the Earth. But here I found my intellectual home because it brought together my concerns for social justice with an internationalist and global outlook, an approach to education that challenged dominant ideological orthodoxies and brought me back to my interest in the work of Paulo Freire. At the launch of the association in 1993, we refer to understanding and challenging global problems, and that education can play a key role in bringing about change towards sustainable visions of the future. During my time as head of the DEA, I had the privilege to oversee a major expansion and support for development education, in part as a result of increased funding from the Department for International Development, under the very inspirational leadership of Claire Short. The level of funding in 1997 was $500,000 a year for development education. By the time of 2010, when the Labour government left office, it was $24 million a year. I had the privilege in this period to be a member of a number of government advisory bodies looking at development awareness, sustainable development education, and global citizenship. This period, led by NGOs such as Oxfam and a network of local development education centres, produced a wealth of materials, developed very successful projects that continue to have an influence on schools. Equally important was the extent to which global themes are now becoming included within mainstream education. And it's here that I particularly want to give mention to, because there are a number of themes that we started to develop during this time that did have a major impact. Global dimension became a cross-curricular theme for schools. The emergence of the term global youth work, alongside strategic initiatives in global further and higher education. Development education was coming engaged in some of the broader debates about the aims and purposes of education. And finally, the emergence of this term, education for global citizenship. Well, when I was into all this work, what I was trying to say to myself, well, what brings this work together? What could you do to summarize this as an example of educational practice? And I found this in what I think some of you in this room may know well, which is an amazing TED Talk by the great Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie, who talks about the dangers of a single story and the ways in which we need to think about the world from a range of different perspectives and worldviews. Views that can challenge the dominant hegemonic approach from education about how we understand the wider world.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature.
That wonderful TED Talk is really worth looking out for, and those of you that are involved directly in working with teachers, you might find it's a very useful professional development tool if you haven't used it already. I continue to find that a very inspirational presentation because to me it sums up a lot of the things that what we've now here at this centre started to talk very much about, as how we could present a range of different worldviews and perspectives. but I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here. I want to go back to my thinking around 2000, 2001, where there was increasing pressure in this expansion of funding for development education to demonstrate effectiveness, impact, evaluation, terms I'm sure many in this room are very familiar with. But what I found, a lot of this area became reduced to technical efficiency, technical ways in which things were seen without little attention to what was the impact of learning. And what I was finding, that I was starting to talk about issues without any evidence to support what I was saying. There was a need for research, there was need for some material to demonstrate the value of this work. Professor Lynn Davis from Birmingham University had commented at this time about how terms like global citizenship started and been emerging, but what did they mean? And that led me to here. I started a conversation about the need for a research centre in the early 2000s, which led me to have conversations with the late Jeff Whitty, Michael Rice, and Ashley Kent, who I hope is here this evening, to talk about some of the things we now see as being an important part of education. And in 2006, I came here as the founding director of the Development Education Research Centre, which for the first 6 years of existence had core funding from the Department for International Development. Central to my task was to raise the profile of development education within the academic community, to secure recognition of its contribution to broader educational goals, and to establish development education as an integral component of mainstream learning within formal education. What I was finding is, whilst there was a lot and a wealth of educational practice produced, resources by NGOs and development education centres, there was far less academic research and academic publications in this area, unlike, say, areas such as intercultural education or environmental education. In 2008, I said, development education is a field of education as a continuing value if it's seen not as learning about development issues, but rather as a pedagogy of making connections between the individual and the personal, from the local to the global, and which, by its very nature, is transformative. It needs to be seen as an approach to education that challenges dominant orthodoxy in education, perceptions about the world, and enables the learner to look at issues in the world from a different place. And this brought me back to some of the ideas and thinking of Paulo Freire. And it's on this basis that we started a very innovative and continually very successful master's program on development education. We developed an amazing network of doctoral students, many of whom are here tonight. And we've produced a range of research reports. And most recently, last year here in this building, launched the academic network of researchers in global education we're calling ANGEL, which already has 300 members. And we've produced now the International Journal of Development Education and Global Learning, which I founded. I now pass on to my colleague, Dr. Claire Bentel. And what I think has also been important about all this is the extent to which all this area has now become part of the broader discourse within this institution, but more generally within the academic world. And I think I'd like to thank my colleagues in the centre, Nicole, Fran, Massimiliano, Claire, and Kester, and many others who have helped us in giving the status that the Development Education Research Centre now has. I'd like now to move on to particularly talk about the Global Learning Programme for England, which is, I had the privilege to be a leading member of, and I suppose wrote one of its main intellectual publications called The Theory and Practice of Global Learning. I want to mention this particularly because what's quite ironic, whilst development education funding really declined dramatically after 2010, what did happen, and to this I have to thank, dare I say it, the current government, for supporting global learning through the Global Learning Programme, which for 5 years engaged over 8,000 schools and probably more than 20,000 teachers in a range of professional development opportunities with support from civil society organisations. What was significant about this program was it moved the leadership for change about global learning from civil society organizations to teachers and schools themselves. The ownership moved. And this empowered many teachers and has resulted in an increased body of expertise in global issues. You can now go to many hundreds of schools in this country and you see global learning very evident in terms of daily practice. We now have a successor program to the global learning program called Connecting Classrooms Through Global Learning. And whilst it's still early days, there's clearly evidence of some of the themes that were part of the global learning program, particularly in the empowerment of teachers in the new program. I also mentioned Angel, and I wanted to also say a little bit about the importance, I think, of the international context. And I want to do this by posing the sense in which the changes have emerged in my time as director of the centre, and the ways in which there's been this move from talking about development education, and Becky sort of alluded to this a bit, to this rather strange, continuing changing terminology to global learning. A lot of people talking about global citizenship education. To me, the term is not what's important, it's what's behind it that's important. I think global learning has now become an important part of a lot of educational practices. The whole usage of global citizenship and global citizenship education. IOE is now part of a university, UCL, where global citizenship is a major theme of its work. But it is this move, the passing the baton from civil society organizations to schools that I particularly want to mention. Because whilst there's clear evidence of increasing practice and engagement of schools and teachers, what has also happened is the funding that it previously existed for NGOs who could provide the expertise and support for this area has rapidly declined. In fact, has almost disappeared. And I want to raise that because I think at a time when there clearly is increased demand and thirst for learning about the wider world, now more than ever do we need people with expertise and specialist skills and knowledge to make sense of the world in which we're living. And the culmination of this decline, which I'm personally very saddened by, is that the association I set up in 1993, the Development Education Association that later became Think Global, closed down last month. I feel that puts increasing burden and responsibility upon our research centre here to make sure that global learning remains part of just not only the landscape of education, because it will do that because many schools and teachers believe in it, but it has advocates and can influence policymakers. And I'm pleased to announce that tonight that the centre, with a range of other organisations, are hoping to establish a new global learning network in 2019. Behind all this, as I think, is this interest in global learning about global issues that has social justice very much at its heart. And what I found from the global learning programme is that teachers became interested in global learning because it was posing an approach to learning they thought they didn't think they could do. It provided an alternative to many of the ideas and approaches they thought they had to teach in the classroom, what I would call a counter-hegemonic approach. This approach means to frame the approach to learning that comes from different principles and starting points that sees learning as all about reproducing bodies of knowledge, of accepting dominant orthodoxies, of seeing education as all about testing and examinations. For example, it means teaching English literature that challenges the curriculum and its overemphasis on British authors. It means suggesting that history is more than kings and queens and the history of English victories around the world. It means stressing the importance of themes such as climate change, global poverty, and the impact of globalization being part of every child's learning. Global learning, however, needs to be more than this. It needs to make connections to the issues of today. And I think, to me, there's important themes that I feel that we've tended to forget. And that means not only just the question of social justice, but it's also about recognizing, I think this has been particularly exemplified, dare I say it, by Brexit, where there's a lot of people in my sector have done a lot of work to promote the global in the local. What does the global perspective mean? But what we've done less of is listen to what the local means to understanding the global. We need to listen to those voices who feel dispossessed. And one of the lectures that I give here quite regularly, I talk about white teenage girl in England saying, "I'm from nowhere." And I think there's a sense in which we need to bring global learning and the discussions that many of us are involved with to make connections to these issues of today. Internationally, some of these things are happening through discussions within UNESCO. I'm particularly hopeful of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that I think provide new opportunities for promoting themes of social justice. I myself have tried to bring some of these themes together in a paper I produced called The Theory and Practice of Global Learning, and in my book that Becky referred to, on the theory and practice of development education, where I talk about the promotion of a global outlook, an understanding of power and inequality in the world, a belief in social justice, and a commitment to reflection, dialogue, and transformation. What I was aiming to address in this volume were themes that pose an approach to education that not only challenged dominant orthodoxies about learning, but offered an alternative approach. And it's this that I think resonates and brings me back to what I raised about teaching as a subversive activity. I want now finally just to talk a little bit about an area of work that I think summarizes this, and this comes from a rather strange place. One of my most cited publications, by the way, and you all have to worry about our citations here at this university, is The Global Engineer. I'm not an engineer, I know nothing about engineering, but with a colleague in engineering, I produced this booklet called The Global Engineer. And in that publication, we produced a suggestion that posed questions about how engineering education should be seen, about moving from fixed positions to looking at concepts and strategies to address complexity, to moving from absorbing information and reproducing bodies of knowledge, to generating knowledge that poses different voices and perspectives, and to recognize that we don't live no longer in structured, ordered, and stable living environments, but things are complex and ever-changing. And I think, to me, this now summarizes, where I now see some of the challenges for global learning today and where we need to move to. And this brings me on to the plug about my book, which I'm happy to sign outside. And I think the importance about this new book to me was I was finding lots of discussions that I had through working in engineering and with other professions, is there was increasing engagement with some of these very complex issues. But there was one looking for new ways to engage with them, and that globalization was posing challenges to be an engineer, to be a doctor, to be a teacher. There are different ways we need to look at the world from different lenses and different perspectives. And we need to move, I would suggest, when we talk about skills, beyond abstract notions of teamwork and cooperation, to contextualize them within the context of what global means. And I think one of the things that I have to bring that together, and you'll have this on your chairs this evening with the hymn song sheets, is this framework for global skills, which I'm not going to read it out to you, thankfully, if you're pleased to know. But behind this was a sense of trying to contextualize what specific skills means and to try and put them in the context that I think that try to engage as people in the 21st century. In the concluding chapter of that volume, I talk about global skills for global social change. I make reference to development of skills to help learners reflect upon their own worldviews, identify new ways of thinking, and to how to harness this for social change. What I particularly focused on were models of training for teachers and educators more broadly and including elements of transformative learning. Global themes are complex and pose questions relating to different worldviews and questioning one's assumptions but above all, equipping the learners with the skills to make sense of the world we're all living in. But what I want to do is to remind ourselves as educationalists of the responsibilities we have in these challenging times. But we need to respond in a way that's not just based on rhetoric or on calling people to campaign for change. We need to give evidence to support our arguments. I've written about how teachers see themselves as agents for social change. But this comes from them from having the confidence and support, and above all, the enthusiasms to harness the creative energies they have. This will not happen just by them saying they want to be agents of social change. It needs to be supported, and they need to have people around them to enable them to move forward. Although I've said there are many major challenges for development education in the UK at present, there are some important international initiatives. And I had the privilege a couple of weeks ago to speak at a global education conference in Portugal, and where there was a discussion about some of the complex issues that are happening around Europe. We think things are bad in this country. You ought to go and talk to educationalists in Hungary and Poland. And you find that some of the things that we're facing today are also happening in many other countries as well. And we need to recognize that the importance of promoting a global outlook, of promoting a way of addressing global issues, needs very much more to be framed, I would suggest, within the current context within which we're now working. And what I also found of that, which I found really interesting, was at the end of that conference, there was the launch of a development education strategy by the Portuguese government, which happens to be of a slightly different political persuasion to the one here in this country. And that strategy was supported and signed at that event by 10 different government agencies. And that, to me, reflected the extent to which you can, in many societies, get endorsement and support from global issues from a whole range of organizations and people. But I want to end my presentation this evening by coming back to the realities of what these themes mean on the ground, at the local level. And I have the privilege of being chair of a local development education centre in Tower Hamlets in East London, the Humanities Education Centre, which brings me into contact with grassroots initiatives. And to me, their latest project, Tafahum, is an excellent example of bringing young people together with policymakers to create safe, collaborative, and shared communities involving drama, film, and photography. It has a strong anti-racist theme and aims to empower and support young people in seeking social change. Tafahum is an Arabic word which means mutual understanding. They take this further in this project to mean mutual understanding which leads to a change of mind and change of heart. They have chosen this Arabic word as it best represents what they feel is close to the hearts of new arrivals to Tower Hamlets, to be heard and to belong. So I'd like to show you this amazing video of young people talking to politicians and to teachers through this initiative called The Long Table, to get them to recognize the important issues they are facing on their daily lives in Tower Hamlets.
When the sharpest words want to cut me down.
Like we said, attacked from the back by 3 males, 2 white, 1 black. And we wanted to present it because we want to stop racial discrimination. attention to myself. I just wasn't doing anything right until one day I did tell my mum about something, and she told me that it's not going to stop unless you show everyone that you won't take it.
So to me, that very inspirational video of a very exciting project that I only heard about a couple of weeks ago, to me brings together many of the things that I think are important to us today, and that is that we live in this era of fake news, of economic nationalism, of Brexit, but as shown in that video, young people and educationalists are responding to these challenges to show the connections with what's happening in their community to global issues. But what is needed is more attention to be given to the knowledge, skills, and values that we need to support people engaged in these issues. We need research to demonstrate the impact of learning. In my latest book, I've focused on skills because, in my view, this area has been too sadly neglected by global educationalists. We all need the skills to respond to the global challenges and to be able to critically reflect upon how the global is portrayed. But I want finally to return to the theme of values of passion and enthusiasms. All the evidence we have undertaken in our research centre here has shown that it's with teachers with passion and enthusiasm who are the champions and drivers of global learning. This may not be surprising, but how do we harness this? Encourage these teachers to see themselves as not working against the tide, but shaping the tide and making things progress. I've undertaken some work with Soka Gaikai International, a lay Buddhist organisation who talk about a value-based perspective to global citizenship education. And I find that particular approach very valuable at this point in time. But I want to end with quotes to my other hero, the great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who wrote about we may be living in difficult times. We may be concerned and seeing the world is challenging. And he wrote this in the 1930s, but is ever present here today. But we have the optimism of the will. And to me, that summarizes what I think many of us here in this institution are concerned with. That education has to have a positive outlook. We have to be drivers for social change to make the world a better place. I want to come back to what I said at the beginning about my own personal journey. Because when I was told by my form teacher that you can go to university, but you probably won't get in, it to me suggested a view about how education was seen and what its purpose was. What I've found through my work here at IOE, my previous work at DEA, was that through working with inspirational teachers and educationalists, we can change the world and we can make the world a better place. But we need support and we need resources. And we need people to inspire us and lead us to make that world a better place. Education may not by itself change the world. It is people who change the world. But people need the knowledge, the skills, and above all, the belief they can do this. Thank you very much.
Doug, that was hugely stimulating and engaging, and I think the extent of applause says it all, really. You've taken us on your journey, a journey of your pedagogy, your engagement with others, your theorization, and your contribution to the whole discipline. I think what's come through is it's not just your individual journey, but it's also a journey that you've shared and you've reached out persistently with other organisations and individuals along the way. And in terms of the changes that you have both challenged and provoked in policy and practice, but then these movements that you've also charted within your talk are just so important, as you've highlighted, in troubled times. Your point about the local informing the global is one that I think we'll all take away this evening, but also the importance of the continuation of your work. So thank you so much again. And now I'm so pleased to introduce our respondent this evening, Dr. Mary Stiasny, OBE. Mary's career has been devoted to opening up access to education and promoting an international outlook in education. Following leadership roles at Goldsmiths, Oxford Brookes University, and the University of Greenwich, where our paths briefly crossed, Mary spent 4 years as Director of Education and Training with the British Council, the UK's international organisation for cultural relations. From there, Mary moved to the Institute of Education as the Pro-Director responsible for our educational provision and our international engagement. And leadership appointments are so important in terms of the tone and the ethos they set for an organisation. And the IOE was hugely fortunate and privileged in that respect to have benefited from Mary's time in office. In her current role as Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at the University of London, Mary's responsible for the world's largest classroom in the form of the University of London's online provision, with its 51,000 students and 1.4 million MOOC participants. So who better then to respond to Doug's lecture and its themes of education and global citizenship? Mary, can I invite you to present your response to the lecture? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky. And I would just like to say how honoured I was and delighted I was to be asked by Doug to act as respondent to his professorial lecture tonight. Doug and I have shared a platform, intertwined our lives in some, professionally speaking, and metaphorically speaking, over many years. We've overlapped and we've coincided many times. And as Becky has said, most recently, I was pro-director here at the IOE, and Doug and I were able to work together on a range of tasks. And in most recent years, since leaving here, I've examined PhD students of Doug's, but more of all that later. When Doug and I spoke about this evening, he stressed that he wanted this to be upbeat and positive, cheerful and strong, which, given the national context at present in the UK, is so important if we're all to survive the doom, gloom and depression of the political climate and happenings. Doug's work is an essential positive contribution in these dark days, where the UK seems hell-bent on becoming isolated and closed off, rather than open and a global player. Doug's emphasis on understanding and debating the social purpose of education and the relationship of learning and skills to securing a more globally just society is fundamental for us as educators, especially at a time when we see the divisions in society growing and deepening, both in the country and across the globe. In his lecture this evening, Doug has talked about the development of thinking about education from way back, starting with Dewey, who highlighted the importance of the realization of one's full potential and the ability to use one's skills for the greater good. In emphasizing the relationship between education and democracy, he challenged the dominant theme at the time of schooling being separate from society. And Doug took this forward, tracing the development of thinking through the writings and thinking of some of our great educational and social thinkers and leaders, Tawney, Freire, Hardy, Althusser, Postman and Weingartner, Giroux, even Tom Paxton, as he said. And in hearing from Doug, I realized that much of his learning experience exactly mirrored some of my own. I too went through these same readings and heard these theories, and probably at round about the same time as Doug was reading them, although I was in London, not in Kiel. And then what is particularly memorable from Doug is the way he related theory to practice. So many of us only theorized and or critiqued. Doug acted. He's told us of his work at Woodcraft Folk and at Friends of the Earth. His commitment was to work for an organization which helped him put his ideas about education for social change into practice. In other words, or rather in Doug's words, the potential role that education could play in transforming society. To be personal, my life copied Doug's to some degree because we both encountered Woodcraft Folk at about the same time. But for me, it was experience as a consumer, at arm's length perhaps. My 3 children all attended a Southeast London Woodcraft Folk group. They loved it. They loved both the weekly sessions and also the weekends or longer camps which were held by their group. Doug was in the driving seat during the years my children were members and learned so much from Woodcraft Folk. They learned and practiced those values of cooperation, social and gender equality, protection of the environment, and commitment to human rights. And they retain those values to this day. So I have a very personal thank you to Doug and his colleagues at Woodcraft Folk from those days. I do, however, have to report that in 1983, when my eldest child spent 10 days at camp, Woodcraft Folk camp, he had to be fumigated when he came home. And that took about 3 days. And then in 1990, Doug's last year at Woodcraft Folk, he was still there, my youngest child had so embraced his place in the world through years of personal and social development activities at Woodcraft Folk that when he was at camp in Cudham, he, like the others, was busy exploring and enjoying the environment to such a degree that with his friends he spent most of his time up in the trees. When he had to come down on this one particular occasion, he had sufficient confidence in himself, thanks to the philosophies he'd learned from Woodcraft Folk, that he didn't bother to climb down. He simply dropped. Inevitably, as you've guessed, he broke his ankle rather badly. Let me just quickly say, I'm not blaming you, Doug. Not at all, although you were the chief executive. Once Doug left Woodcraft Folk, he moved quickly via, as we've heard, Friends of the Earth, to then set up the Development Education Association. This was a groundbreaking association whose commitment, again, was the combination of social justice with an internationalist or global outlook. Again, the stated principle was that education plays a key role in bringing about change towards sustainable visions for the future. Doug's leadership meant the major expansion of development education in and across all sectors of education, leading to those terms we now take for granted: global citizenship, global perspectives education, global skills, and global youth work, now known as part of mainstream education. And above all, the need, as Doug says, to recognize the voices of the global South. And it was during this time that Doug's and my paths crossed more directly. I was then the Director of Education and Training at the British Council, and Doug came to visit to discuss how we might collaborate. And this relationship between our two organisations led to our facilitating the British Council in developing a greater awareness of its own approaches to international educational partnership work, and eventually bringing together the British Council's Connecting Classrooms programme with global learning. At this time, the importance of Doug's approach was to focus on what was learned and what learners did with the learning, rather than on effectiveness and efficiency. There was, as he said, a tendency at the time to examine development education's role in combating global poverty. And Doug has pointed out the difficulty of proving this and the danger of totally ignoring the place of the learner. At this time, as we've heard, Professor Lynn Davis was highlighting the lack of clarity on what was meant by the term global citizenship, a term we all then used freely. She identified the need for more research on the long-term impact of global citizenship education, So Doug began talking to DFID about the need for a research centre, and as we've heard, they agreed to fund it. And it was also agreed with the late Professor Jeff Whitty, the then director of the IOE, that this should be hosted here. There were 3 goals: to raise the profile of development education within the academic community, to secure recognition of the contribution development education makes to broader educational goals, and to establish development education as an integral component of mainstream learning within formal education. Well, one might say that for many of us, all roads led to Bloomsbury, not Rome, and I too then ended up here at the IOE 1 year after Doug, joining as first assistant director with responsibility for teaching and learning as well as international, and later as pro-director. And this meant that yet again, Doug's and my roles intersected. One of the ways we worked together was that Doug helped draft the policy for internationalizing the curriculum. Really important task and a really important step for us, for it to embrace the needs of the international students coming here, as well as the needs of the home students staying here at home to study. And Doug's expertise and leadership was essential to this piece. At the time, I watched the development of the Development Education Research Centre with admiration, and the associated body of students following both the very successful master's programme and also the doctoral cohorts. What is interesting is that, however we think that the UK may have created a hostile environment, yet international students still come to study here, and development education, global learning, and global skills remain a focus of interest and play a part in bringing them here. Articles and reports abounded from the centre, and journals followed. Under Doug's leadership, the centre has surely flourished, and the reach of the centre is truly global. What is disconcerting is that in contrast over recent years, the UK's commitment to and involvement in development education has diminished. Doug has aired and shared his concerns today for the future of development education. The leadership role Doug has been playing in global learning and its response to and support for the thousands of teachers and schools is of vital importance. The charity-type approach so many schools had traditionally taken has been challenged by Doug and, through him, the Development Education Research Centre, while the development education ideas and practices have been grounded in a philosophy of social justice. Doug has challenged all of us tonight to support and maintain the breadth of this approach and not to allow the increasing impact of austerity and of Brexit to let us retreat into a narrow, isolated stance. He's argued in his work, The Global Engineer, that we need to move to develop concepts and strategies to address complexity, difference, and uncertainty. And these strategies we surely need now, more than at any other time in our country's history and in the history of global interrelationships. While his latest book, Understanding Global Skills for 21st Century Professionals, you can get them outside and he'll sign them for you, is not a blueprint or manifesto for action, it does challenge us to see the connections between our own local experiences and the broader or more distant global ones. As educationalists, Doug is asking us to respond to the challenges we face today in an era of fake news, social media, economic nationalism, and Brexit. He said, and it bears saying again, teachers with passion and enthusiasm are the champions and drivers of global learning. And education by itself won't change the world. People do. And Doug himself has made a major contribution to this change that we seek through his writing, his teaching, his research, his leadership, and perhaps most importantly, living the theory. Towards the end of his lecture, Doug spoke to us about the work he's doing as chair of a development education centre in Tower Hamlets in East London, and we saw the short video. This again shows his leadership and commitment towards developing the mutual understanding we need to nurture as a major priority. Indeed, Doug might say the leading priority in our world today. Let us all celebrate his work and take up his challenge. Doug, we salute you.
Thank you so much, Doug and Mary, for an incredibly stimulating, rich and thought-provoking set of reflections. Now, my usual task at this point is to invite everyone through to the reception. But before we do that, though, Doug would like to round off his professorial lecture by playing a short recording. And it's a recording of Aretha Franklin singing Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come, the lyrics of which really encapsulate what we've been discussing this evening. So as we set that up, let's thank Doug and Mary in the traditional way.